Russia, or the Russian Federation, is a country spanning Eastern Europe and North Asia. It is the largest country in the world by area, extending across 11 time zones and sharing land borders with 14 countries. It is the world's 9th most populous country and Europe's most populous country. Russia is a highly urbanized country including 16 population centers with over 1 million inhabitants. Its capital as well as its largest city is Moscow. St. Petersburg is Russia's second largest city and its cultural capital. The East Slavs emerged as a recognized group in Europe between the 3rd and 8th centuries CE. The first East Slavic state, Kievan Rus, arose in the 9th century, and in 988, it adopted Orthodox Christianity from the Byzantine Empire. Rus ultimately disintegrated, with the Grand Duchy of Moscow growing to become the Tsardom of Russia. By the early 18th century, Russia had vastly expanded through conquest, annexation, and the efforts of Russian explorers, developing into the Russian Empire, which remains the 3rd largest empire in history. However, with the Russian Revolution in 1917, Russia's monarchic rule was abolished and eventually replaced by the Russian SFSR, the world's first constitutionally socialist state. Following the Russian Civil War, the Russian SFSR established the Soviet Union with 3 other Soviet republics, within which it was the largest and principal constituent. At the expense of millions of lives, the Soviet Union underwent rapid industrialization in the 1930s and later played a decisive role for the Allies in World War II by leading large-scale efforts on the Eastern Front. With the onset of the Cold War, it competed with the United States for global ideological influence. The Soviet era of the 20th century saw some of the most significant Russian technological achievements, including the first human-made satellite and the first human expedition into outer space. In 1991, the Russian SFSR emerged from the dissolution of the Soviet Union as the independent Russian Federation. A new constitution was adopted, which established a federal semi-presidential system. Since the turn of the century, Russia's political system has been dominated by Vladimir Putin, under whom the country has experienced democratic backsliding and a shift towards authoritarianism. Russia has been militarily involved in a number of conflicts in former Soviet states and other countries, including its war with Georgia in 2008 and annexation of Crimea in 2014 from neighboring Ukraine, followed by the further annexation of 4 other regions in 2022 during an ongoing invasion. Internationally, Russia ranks among the lowest in measurements of democracy, human rights, and freedom of the press. The country also has high levels of perceived corruption. Russia's advanced economy ranks among the largest in the world, relying on its vast mineral and energy resources, the world's 2nd largest for oil production and natural gas production. Russia possesses the largest stockpile of nuclear weapons and has the 3rd highest military expenditure. The country is a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council, a member state of the G20, SCO, BRICS, APEC, OSCE, and WTO, and the leading member state of post-Soviet organizations such as CIS, CSTO, and EAEU. Russia is home to 30 UNESCO World Heritage Sites. History. Early history. The first human settlement on Russia dates back to the Oldowan period in the early Lower Paleolithic. About 2 million years ago, representatives of Homo erectus migrated to the Taman Peninsula in southern Russia. Flint tools, some 1.5 million years old, have been discovered in the North Caucasus. Radiocarbon-dated specimens from Denisova Cave in the Altai Mountains estimate the oldest Denisovan specimen lived 700 years ago. Fossils of Deni, an archaic human hybrid that was half Neanderthal and half Denisovan, and lived some 90,000 years ago, was also found within the latter cave. Russia was home to some of the last surviving Neanderthals, from about 45,000 years ago, found in Mezmaiskaya cave. The first trace of an early modern human in Russia dates back to 45,000 years, in western Siberia. The discovery of high-concentration cultural remains of anatomically modern humans, from at least 40,000 years ago, was found at Kostyunki, Brshchiovo, and at Sungur, dating back to 34,600 years ago both in western Russia. Humans reached Arctic Russia at least 40,000 years ago, in Mamontovaya Kuria. Ancient North Eurasian populations from Siberia genetically similar to Malta, Buret culture and Afontova Gora were an important genetic contributor to ancient Native Americans and Eastern hunter-gatherers. The Kurgan hypothesis places the Volga-Dnieper region of southern Russia and Ukraine as the Uramat of the Proto-Indo-Europeans. Early Indo-European migrations from the Pontic, Caspian steppe of Ukraine and Russia spread Yamnaya ancestry and Indo-European languages across large parts of Eurasia. Nomadic pastoralism developed in the Pontic, Caspian steppe beginning in the Chalcolithic. Remnants of these steppe civilizations were discovered in places such as Ipatovo, Sintashta, Archim, and Pazarik, which bear the earliest known traces of horses in warfare. The genetic makeup of speakers of the Uralic language family in northern Europe was shaped by migration from Siberia that began at least 3,500 years ago. In the 3rd to 4th centuries CE, the Gothic kingdom of Oyum existed in southern Russia, which was later overrun by Huns. Between the 3rd and 6th centuries CE, the Bosporan kingdom, which was a Hellenistic polity that succeeded the Greek colonies, was also overwhelmed by nomadic invasions led by warlike tribes such as the Huns and Eurasian Avars. The Hazars, who were of Turkic origin, ruled the steppes between the Caucasus in the south, to the east past the Volga River basin, and west as far as Kiev on the Dnieper River until the 10th century. After them came the Pechenegs, who created a large confederacy, which was subsequently taken over by the Cumans and the Kipchuks. The ancestors of Russians are among the Slavic tribes that separated from the Proto-Indo-Europeans, who appeared in the northeastern part of Europe c. 1,500 years ago. The East Slavs gradually settled western Russia approximately between modern Moscow and St. Petersburg in two waves, one moving from Kiev towards present-day Suzdal and Murom and another from Polotsk towards Novgorod and Rostov. Prior to Slavic migration, that territory was populated by Finno-Ugrian peoples. From the 7th century onwards, the incoming East Slavs slowly assimilated the native Finno-Ugrians. The establishment of the first East Slavic states in the 9th century coincided with the arrival of Varangians, the Vikings who ventured along the waterways extending from the eastern Baltic to the Black and Caspian seas. According to the primary chronicle, a Varangian from the Rus people, named Rurik, was elected ruler of Novgorod in 862. In 882, his successor Oleg ventured south and conquered Kiev, which had been previously paying tribute to the Hazars. Rurik's son Igor and Igor's son Sviatoslav subsequently subdued all local East Slavic tribes to Kievan rule, destroyed the Hazar Khaganate, and launched several military expeditions to Byzantium and Persia. In the 10th to 11th centuries, Kievan Rus became one of the largest and most prosperous states in Europe. The reigns of Vladimir the Great and his son Yaroslav the Wise constitute the Golden Age of Kiev, which saw the acceptance of Orthodox Christianity from Byzantium, and the creation of the first East Slavic written legal code, the Russkaya Pravda. The age of feudalism and decentralization had come, marked by constant infighting between members of the Rurik dynasty that ruled Kievan Rus collectively. Kiev's dominance waned, to the benefit of Vladimir Suzdal in the northeast, the Novgorod Republic in the north, and Galicia Volhynia in the southwest. By the 12th century, Kiev lost its preeminence and Kievan Rus had fragmented into different principalities. Prince Andrei Bogolyubsky sacked Kiev in 1169 and made Vladimir his base, leading to political power being shifted to the northeast. Led by Prince Alexander Nevsky, Novgorodians repelled the invading Swedes in the Battle of the Neva in 1240, as well as the Germanic Crusaders in the Battle on the Ice in 1242. Kievan Rus finally fell to the Mongol invasion of 1240, which resulted in the sacking of Kiev and other cities, as well as the death of a major part of the population. The invaders, later known as Tatars, formed the state of the Golden Horde, which ruled over Russia for the next 2 centuries. Only the Novgorod Republic escaped foreign occupation after it agreed to pay tribute to the Mongols. Galicia-Volhynia would later be absorbed by Lithuania and Poland, while the Novgorod Republic continued to prosper in the north. In the northeast, the Byzantine Slavic traditions of Kievan Rus were adapted to form the Russian autocratic state. The destruction of Kievan Rus saw the eventual rise of the Grand Duchy of Moscow, initially a part of Vladimir Suzdal, while still under the domain of the Mongol Tatars, and with their connivance, Moscow began to assert its influence in the region in the early 14th century, gradually becoming the leading force in the gathering of the Russian lands. When the seat of the Metropolitan of the Russian Orthodox Church moved to Moscow in 1325, its influence increased. Moscow's last rival, the Novgorod Republic, prospered as the chief fur trade center and the easternmost port of the Hanseatic League. Led by Prince Dmitry Donskoy of Moscow, the united army of Russian principalities inflicted a milestone defeat on the Mongol Tatars in the Battle of Kulikovo in 1380. Moscow gradually absorbed its parent duchy and surrounding principalities, including formerly strong rivals such as Tver and Novgorod. Ivan III threw off the control of the Golden Horde and consolidated the whole of northern Rus under Moscow's dominion, and was the first Russian ruler to take the title Grand Duke of all Rus. After the fall of Constantinople in 1453, Moscow claimed succession to the legacy of the Eastern Roman Empire. Ivan III married Sophia Palaiologina, the niece of the last Byzantine Emperor Constantine XI, and made the Byzantine double-headed eagle his own, and eventually Russia's, coat of arms. Vasily III united all of Russia by annexing the last few independent Russian states in the early 16th century. In development of the Third Rome ideas, the Grand Duke Ivan IV was officially crowned the first Tsar of Russia in 1547. The Tsar promulgated a new code of laws, established the first Russian feudal representative body, revamped the military, curbed the influence of the clergy, and reorganized local government. During his long reign, Ivan nearly doubled the already large Russian territory by annexing the 3 Tatar Khanates, Kazan and Astrakhan along the Volga, and the Khanate of Sibir in southwestern Siberia. Ultimately, by the end of the 16th century, Russia expanded east of the Ural Mountains. However, the Tsardom was weakened by the long and unsuccessful Livonian War against the coalition of the Kingdom of Poland and the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, the Kingdom of Sweden, and Denmark, Norway for access to the Baltic coast and sea trade. In 1572, an invading army of Crimean Tatars were thoroughly defeated in the crucial Battle of Molody. The death of Ivan's sons marked the end of the ancient Rurik dynasty in 1598, and in combination with the disastrous famine of 1602, led to a civil war, the rule of pretenders, and foreign intervention during the time of troubles in the early 17th century. The Polish, Lithuanian Commonwealth, taking advantage, occupied parts of Russia, extending into the capital Moscow. In 1612, the Poles were forced to retreat by the Russian Volunteer Corps, led by merchant Kuzma Minin and Prince Dmitry Pozersky. The Romanov dynasty acceded to the throne in 1613 by the decision of the Zemsky Sobor, and the country started its gradual recovery from the crisis. Russia continued its territorial growth through the 17th century, which was the age of the Cossacks. In 1654, the Ukrainian leader, Bogdan Khmelnytsky, offered to place Ukraine under the protection of the Russian Tsar, Alexis, whose acceptance of this offer led to another Russo-Polish war. Ultimately, Ukraine was split along the Dnieper, leaving the eastern part under Russian rule. In the east, the rapid Russian exploration and colonization of vast Siberia continued, hunting for valuable furs and ivory. Russian explorers pushed eastward primarily along the Siberian river routes, and by the mid-17th century, there were Russian settlements in eastern Siberia, on the Chukchi Peninsula, along the Amur River, and on the coast of the Pacific Ocean. In 1648, Semyon Dzhanyov became the first European to navigate through the Bering Strait. Imperial Russia. Under Peter the Great, Russia was proclaimed an empire in 1721, and established itself as one of the European great powers. Ruling from 1682 to 1725, Peter defeated Sweden in the Great Northern War, securing Russia's access to the sea and sea trade. In 1703, on the Baltic Sea, Peter founded St. Petersburg as Russia's new capital. Throughout his rule, sweeping reforms were made, which brought significant Western European cultural influences to Russia. He was succeeded by Catherine I, followed by Peter II, and Anna. The reign of Peter I's daughter Elizabeth in 1741 saw Russia's participation in the 7 Years' War. During the conflict, Russian troops overran East Prussia, reaching Berlin. However, upon Elizabeth's death, all these conquests were returned to the Kingdom of Prussia by pro-Prussian Peter III of Russia. Catherine II, who ruled in 1762 to 1796, presided over the Russian Age of Enlightenment. She extended Russian political control over the Polish, Lithuanian Commonwealth and annexed most of its territories into Russia, making it the most populous country in Europe. In the south, after the successful Russo-Turkish wars against the Ottoman Empire, Catherine advanced Russia's boundary to the Black Sea, by dissolving the Crimean Khanate, and annexing Crimea. As a result of victories over Qajar Iran through the Russo-Persian Wars, by the first half of the 19th century, Russia also conquered the Caucasus. Catherine's successor, her son Paul, was unstable and focused predominantly on domestic issues. Following his short reign, Catherine's strategy was continued with Alexander I's wresting of Finland from the weakened Sweden in 1809, and of Bessarabia from the Ottomans in 1812. In North America, the Russians became the first Europeans to reach and colonize Alaska. In 1803 to 1806, the first Russian circumnavigation was made. In 1820, a Russian expedition discovered the continent of Antarctica. Great power and development of society, sciences, and arts. During the Napoleonic Wars, Russia joined alliances with various European powers, and fought against France. The French invasion of Russia at the height of Napoleon's power in 1812 reached Moscow, but eventually failed as the obstinate resistance in combination with the bitterly cold Russian winter led to a disastrous defeat of invaders, in which the pan-European Grande Army faced utter destruction. Led by Mikhail Kutuzov and Michael Andreas Barclay de Tolly, the Imperial Russian Army ousted Napoleon and drove throughout Europe in the War of the Sixth Coalition, ultimately entering Paris. Alexander I controlled Russia's delegation at the Congress of Vienna, which defined the map of post-Napoleonic Europe. The officers who pursued Napoleon into Western Europe brought ideas of liberalism back to Russia, and attempted to curtail the Tsar's powers during the abortive Decembrist revolt of 1825. At the end of the conservative reign of Nicholas I, a zenith period of Russia's power and influence in Europe, was disrupted by defeat in the Crimean War. Great liberal reforms and capitalism. Nicholas's successor Alexander II enacted significant changes throughout the country, including the Emancipation Reform of 1861. These reforms spurred industrialization, and modernized the Imperial Russian Army, which liberated much of the Balkans from Ottoman rule in the aftermath of the 1877 Russo-Turkish War. During most of the 19th and early 20th century, Russia and Britain colluded over Afghanistan and its neighboring territories in Central and South Asia. The rivalry between the two major European empires came to be known as the Great Game. The late 19th century saw the rise of various socialist movements in Russia. Alexander II was assassinated in 1881 by revolutionary terrorists. The reign of his son Alexander III was less liberal but more peaceful. Under last Russian Emperor, Nicholas II, the revolution of 1905 was triggered by the failure of the humiliating Russo-Japanese War. The uprising was put down, but the government was forced to concede major reforms, including granting freedoms of speech and assembly, the legalization of political parties, and the creation of an elected legislative body, the State Duma. Revolution and Civil War. In 1914, Russia entered World War I in response to Austria-Hungary's declaration of war on Russia's ally Serbia, and fought across multiple fronts while isolated from its Triple Entente allies. In 1916, the Brusilov offensive of the Imperial Russian Army almost completely destroyed the Austro-Hungarian army. However, the already existing public distrust of the regime was deepened by the rising costs of war, high casualties, and rumors of corruption and treason. All this formed the climate for the Russian Revolution of 1917, carried out in two major acts. In early 1917, Nicholas II was forced to abdicate. He and his family were imprisoned and later executed during the Russian Civil War. The monarchy was replaced by a shaky coalition of political parties that declared itself the provisional government, and proclaimed the Russian Republic. On January 19, 1918, the Russian Constituent Assembly declared Russia a democratic federal republic. The next day the Constituent Assembly was dissolved by the All-Russian Central Executive Committee. An alternative socialist establishment coexisted, the Petrograd Soviet, wielding power through the democratically elected councils of workers and peasants, called Soviets. The rule of the new authorities only aggravated the crisis in the country instead of resolving it, and eventually, the October Revolution, led by Bolshevik leader Vladimir Lenin, overthrew the provisional government and gave full governing power to the Soviets, leading to the creation of the world's first socialist state. The Russian Civil War broke out between the anti-communist White Movement and the Bolsheviks with its Red Army. In the aftermath of signing the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk that concluded hostilities with the Central Powers of World War I, Bolshevist Russia surrendered most of its western territories, which hosted 34% of its population, 54% of its industries, 32% of its agricultural land, and roughly 90% of its coal mines. The Allied powers launched an unsuccessful military intervention in support of anti-communist forces. In the meantime, both the Bolsheviks and White Movement carried out campaigns of deportations and executions against each other, known respectively as the Red Terror and White Terror. By the end of the violent civil war, Russia's economy and infrastructure were heavily damaged, and as many as 10 million perished during the war, mostly civilians. Millions became white émigrés, and the Russian famine of 1921 to 1922 claimed up to 5 million victims. Soviet Union. On December 30, 1922, Lenin and his aides formed the Soviet Union, by joining the Russian SFSR into a single state with the Belarusian, Transcaucasian, and Ukrainian republics. Eventually, internal border changes and annexations during World War II created a union of 15 republics, the largest in size and population being the Russian SFSR, which dominated the union politically, culturally, and economically. Following Lenin's death in 1924, a troika was designated to take charge. Eventually Joseph Stalin, the General Secretary of the Communist Party, managed to suppress all opposition factions and consolidate power in his hands to become the country's dictator by the 1930s. Leon Trotsky, the main proponent of world revolution, was exiled from the Soviet Union in 1929, and Stalin's idea of socialism in one country became the official line. The continued internal struggle in the Bolshevik Party culminated in the Great Purge. Under Stalin's leadership, the government launched a command economy, industrialization of the largely rural country, and collectivization of its agriculture. During this period of rapid economic and social change, millions of people were sent to penal labor camps, including many political convicts for their suspected or real opposition to Stalin's rule, and millions were deported and exiled to remote areas of the Soviet Union. The transitional disorganization of the country's agriculture, combined with the harsh state policies and a drought, led to the Soviet famine of 1932 to 1933, which killed up to 8.7 million, 3.3 million of them in the Russian SFSR. The Soviet Union, ultimately, made the costly transformation from a largely agrarian economy to a major industrial powerhouse within a short span of time. The Soviet Union entered World War II on September 17, 1939 with its invasion of Poland, in accordance with a secret protocol within the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact with Nazi Germany. The Soviet Union later invaded Finland, and occupied and annexed the Baltic states, as well as parts of Romania. On June 22, 1941, Germany invaded the Soviet Union, opening the Eastern Front, the largest theater of World War II. Eventually, some 5 million Red Army troops were captured by the Nazis. The latter deliberately starved to death or otherwise killed 3.3 million Soviet POWs, and a vast number of civilians, as the Hunger Plan sought to fulfill General Plan Ost. Although the Wehrmacht had considerable early success, their attack was halted in the Battle of Moscow. Subsequently, the Germans were dealt major defeats, first at the Battle of Stalingrad in the winter of 1942 to 1943, and then in the Battle of Kursk in the summer of 1943. Another German failure was the Siege of Leningrad, in which the city was fully blockaded on land between 1941 and 1944 by German and Finnish forces, and suffered starvation and more than 1 million deaths, but never surrendered. Soviet forces steamrolled through Eastern and Central Europe in 1944 to 1945 and captured Berlin in May 1945. In August 1945, the Red Army invaded Manchuria and ousted the Japanese from Northeast Asia, contributing to the Allied victory over Japan. The 1941 to 1945 period of World War II is known in Russia as the Great Patriotic War. The Soviet Union, along with the United States, the United Kingdom and China, were considered the Big Four of Allied powers in World War II, and later became the Four Policemen, which was the foundation of the United Nations Security Council. During the war, Soviet civilian and military death were about 26 to 27 million, accounting for about half of all World War II casualties. The Soviet economy and infrastructure suffered massive devastation, which caused the Soviet famine of 1946 to 1947. However, at the expense of a large sacrifice, the Soviet Union emerged as a global superpower. Superpower and Cold War. After World War II, according to the Potsdam Conference, the Red Army occupied parts of Eastern and Central Europe, including East Germany and the eastern regions of Austria. Dependent communist governments were installed in the Eastern Bloc satellite states. After becoming the world's second nuclear power, the Soviet Union established the Warsaw Pact alliance, and entered into a struggle for global dominance, known as the Cold War, with the rivaling United States and NATO. After Stalin's death in 1953 and a short period of collective rule, the new leader Nikita Khrushchev denounced Stalin and launched the policy of de-Stalinization, releasing many political prisoners from the Gulag labor camps. The general easement of repressive policies became known later as the Khrushchev Thaw. At the same time, Cold War tensions reached its peak when the two rivals clashed over the deployment of the United States Jupiter missiles in Turkey and Soviet missiles in Cuba. In 1957, the Soviet Union launched the world's first artificial satellite, Sputnik 1, thus starting the space age. Russian cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin became the first human to orbit the Earth, aboard the Vostok 1 crewed spacecraft on April 12, 1961. Following the ousting of Khrushchev in 1964, another period of collective rule ensued, until Leonid Brezhnev became the leader. The era of the 1970s and the early 1980s was later designated as the era of stagnation. The 1965 Kosygin reform aimed for partial decentralization of the Soviet economy. In 1979, after a communist-led revolution in Afghanistan, Soviet forces invaded the country, ultimately starting the Soviet-Afghan War. In May 1988, the Soviets started to withdraw from Afghanistan, due to international opposition, persistent anti-Soviet guerrilla warfare, and a lack of support by Soviet citizens. From 1985 onwards, the last Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev, who sought to enact liberal reforms in the Soviet system, introduced the policies of glasnost and perestroika in an attempt to end the period of economic stagnation and to democratize the government. This, however, led to the rise of strong nationalist and separatist movements across the country. Prior to 1991, the Soviet economy was the world's second largest, but during its final years, it went into a crisis. By 1991, economic and political turmoil began to boil over as the Baltic states chose to secede from the Soviet Union. On March 17, a referendum was held, in which the vast majority of participating citizens voted in favor of changing the Soviet Union into a renewed federation. In June 1991, Boris Yeltsin became the first directly elected president in Russian history when he was elected president of the Russian SFSR. In August 1991, a coup d'état attempt by members of Gorbachev's government, directed against Gorbachev and aimed at preserving the Soviet Union, instead led to the end of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. On December 25, 1991, following the dissolution of the Soviet Union, along with contemporary Russia, 14 other post-Soviet states emerged. Independent Russian Federation. The economic and political collapse of the Soviet Union led Russia into a deep and prolonged depression. During and after the disintegration of the Soviet Union, wide-ranging reforms including privatization and market and trade liberalization were undertaken, including radical changes along the lines of shock therapy. The privatization largely shifted control of enterprises from state agencies to individuals with inside connections in the government, which led to the rise of Russian oligarchs. Many of the newly rich moved billions in cash and assets outside of the country in an enormous capital flight. The depression of the economy led to the collapse of social services. The birth rate plummeted while the death rate skyrocketed, and millions plunged into poverty, while extreme corruption, as well as criminal gangs and organized crime rose significantly. In late 1993, tensions between Yeltsin and the Russian parliament culminated in a constitutional crisis which ended violently through military force. During the crisis, Yeltsin was backed by Western governments, and over 100 people were killed. In December, a referendum was held and approved, which introduced a new constitution, giving the president enormous powers. The 1990s were plagued by armed conflicts in the North Caucasus, both local ethnic skirmishes and separatist Islamist insurrections. From the time Chechen separatists declared independence in the early 1990s, an intermittent guerrilla war was fought between the rebel groups and Russian forces. Terrorist attacks against civilians were carried out by Chechen separatists, claiming the lives of thousands of Russian civilians. After the dissolution of the Soviet Union, Russia assumed responsibility for settling the latter's external debts. In 1992, most consumer price controls were eliminated, causing extreme inflation and significantly devaluing the ruble. High budget deficits coupled with increasing capital flight and inability to pay back debts, caused the 1998 Russian financial crisis, which resulted in a further GDP decline. On December 31, 1999, President Yeltsin unexpectedly resigned, handing the post to the recently appointed Prime Minister and his chosen successor, Vladimir Putin. Putin then won the 2000 presidential election, and defeated the Chechen insurgency in the Second Chechen War. Putin won a second presidential term in 2004. High oil prices and a rise in foreign investment saw the Russian economy and living standards improve significantly. Putin's rule increased stability, while transforming Russia into an authoritarian state. In 2008, Putin took the post of Prime Minister, while Dmitry Medvedev was elected president for one term, to hold onto power despite legal term limits. This period has been described as a tandemocracy. Following a diplomatic crisis with neighboring Georgia, the Russo-Georgian War took place during 1–12 August 2008, resulting in Russia recognizing two separatist states in the territories that it occupies in Georgia. It was the first European war of the 21st century. Government and politics. Russia, by 1993 constitution, is a symmetric federal republic with a semi-presidential system, wherein the president is the head of state, and the prime minister is the head of government. It is structured as a multi-party representative democracy, with the federal government composed of three branches. Legislative, the bicameral Federal Assembly of Russia, made up of the 450-member State Duma and the 170-member Federation Council, adopts federal law, declares war, approves treaties, has the power of the purse and the power of impeachment of the president. Executive, the president is the commander-in-chief of the armed forces, and appoints the government of Russia and other officers, who administer and enforce federal laws and policies. The president may issue decrees of unlimited scope, so long as they do not contradict the Constitution or federal law. Judiciary, the Constitutional Court, Supreme Court, and lower federal courts, whose judges are appointed by the Federation Council on the recommendation of the President, interpret laws and can overturn laws they deem unconstitutional. The President is elected by popular vote for a 6-year term and may be elected no more than twice. Ministries of the government are composed of the Premier and his deputies, ministers, and selected other individuals. All are appointed by the President on the recommendation of the Prime Minister, whereas the appointment of the latter requires the consent of the State Duma. United Russia is the dominant political party in Russia, and has been described as Big Tent and the party of power. Under the administrations of Vladimir Putin, Russia has experienced democratic backsliding, and has become an authoritarian state under a dictatorship, with Putin's policies being referred to as Putinism. Political divisions. Russia, by 1993 constitution, is a symmetric with the possibility of an asymmetric configuration federation. Unlike the Soviet asymmetric model of the RSFSR, where only republics were subjects of the Federation, the current constitution raised the status of other regions to the level of republics and made all regions equal with the title subject of the Federation. The regions of Russia have reserved areas of competence, but no regions have sovereignty, do not have the status of a sovereign state, do not have the right to indicate any sovereignty in their constitutions, and do not have the right to secede from the country. The laws of the regions cannot contradict federal laws. The federal subjects have equal representation in the Federation Council, the upper house of the Federal Assembly. They do, however, differ in the degree of autonomy they enjoy. The federal districts of Russia were established by Putin in 2000 to facilitate central government control of the federal subjects. Originally 7, currently there are 8 federal districts, each headed by an envoy appointed by the president. Foreign relations. Russia had the world's 5th largest diplomatic network in 2019. It maintains diplomatic relations with 190 United Nations member states, 4 partially recognized states, and 3 United Nations observer states, along with 144 embassies. Russia is one of the 5 permanent members of the United Nations Security Council. It has historically been a great power, and a former superpower as the leading constituent of the former Soviet Union. Russia is a member of the G20, the OSCE, and the APEC. Russia also takes a leading role in organizations such as the CIS, the EAEU, the CSTO, the SCO, and BRICS. Russia maintains close relations with neighboring Belarus, which is a part of the Union State, a supranational confederation of the 2 states. Serbia has been a historically close ally of Russia, as both countries share a strong mutual cultural, ethnic, and religious affinity. India is the largest customer of Russian military equipment, and the 2 countries share a strong strategic and diplomatic relationship since the Soviet era. Russia wields influence across the geopolitically important South Caucasus and Central Asia, and the 2 regions have been described as Russia's backyard. In the 21st century, Russia has pursued an aggressive foreign policy aimed at securing regional dominance and international influence, as well as increasing domestic support for the government. Military intervention in the post-Soviet states include a war with Georgia in 2008, and the invasion and destabilization of Ukraine beginning in 2014. Russia has also sought to increase its influence in the Middle East, most significantly through military intervention in the Syrian civil war. Cyber warfare and airspace violations, along with electoral interference, have been used to increase perceptions of Russian power. Russia's relations with neighboring Ukraine and the Western world, especially the United States, the European Union, the United Nations and NATO, have collapsed, especially following the start of the Russo-Ukrainian War in 2014 and the consequent escalation in 2022. Relations between Russia and China have significantly strengthened bilaterally and economically, due to shared political interests. Turkey and Russia share a complex strategic, energy, and defense relationship. Russia maintains cordial relations with Iran, as it is a strategic and economic ally. Russia has also increasingly pushed to expand its influence across the Arctic, Asia-Pacific, Africa, the Middle East, and Latin America. According to the Economist Intelligence Unit, 2/3 of the world's population live in countries such as China or India that are neutral or leaning towards Russia. Economy. Russia has a market economy, with enormous natural resources, particularly oil and natural gas. It has the world's 9th largest economy by nominal GDP and the 6th largest by PPP. The large service sector accounts for 62% of total GDP, followed by the industrial sector, while the agricultural sector is the smallest, making up only 5% of total GDP. Russia has a low official unemployment rate of 4%. Its foreign exchange reserves are the world's fifth largest, worth 540 billion. It has a labor force of roughly 70 million, which is the world's sixth largest. Russia is the world's 13th largest exporter and the 21st largest importer. It relies heavily on revenues from oil and gas-related taxes and export tariffs, which accounted for 45% of Russia's federal budget revenues in January 2022, and up to 60% of its exports in 2019. Russia has one of the lowest levels of external debt among major economies, although its inequality of household income and wealth is one of the highest among developed countries. High regional disparity is also an issue. After over a decade of post-Soviet rapid economic growth, backed by high oil prices and a surge in foreign exchange reserves and investment, Russia's economy was damaged following the start of the Russo-Ukrainian War and the annexation of Crimea in 2014, due to the first wave of international sanctions being imposed. In the aftermath of the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022, the country has faced revamped sanctions and corporate boycotts, becoming the most sanctioned country in the world, in a move described as an all-out economic and financial war to isolate the Russian economy from the Western financial system. Due to the impact, the Russian government has stopped publishing a raft of economic data since April 2022. Economists suggest the sanctions will have a long-term effect over the Russian economy. Language. Russian is the official and the predominantly spoken language in Russia. It is the most spoken native language in Europe, the most geographically widespread language of Eurasia, as well as the world's most widely spoken Slavic language. Russian is one of two official languages aboard the International Space Station, as well as one of the 6 official languages of the United Nations. Russia is a multilingual nation. Approximately 100 to 150 minority languages are spoken across the country. According to the Russian census of 2010, 137.5 million across the country spoke Russian, 4.3 million spoke Tatar, and 1.1 million spoke Ukrainian. The Constitution gives the country's individual republics the right to establish their own state languages in addition to Russian, as well as guarantee its citizens the right to preserve their native language and to create conditions for its study and development. However, various experts have claimed Russia's linguistic diversity is rapidly declining due to many languages becoming endangered. Religion. Russia is a secular state by constitution, and its largest religion is Eastern Orthodox Christianity, chiefly represented by the Russian Orthodox Church. Orthodox Christianity, together with Islam, Buddhism, and paganism, are recognized by Russian law as the traditional religions of the country, part of its historical heritage. Islam is the second largest religion in Russia, and is the traditional religion among the majority of the peoples of the North Caucasus, and among some Turkic peoples scattered along the Volga-Ural region. Large populations of Buddhists are the vast majority of the population in Tuva. Many Russians practice other religions, including Rodnovery, Asianism, other ethnic paganisms, and interpagan movements such as Ringing Cedars Anastasianism, various movements of Hinduism, Shamanism, and Tengrism, various neo-theosophical movements such as Rorichism, and other faiths. Some religious minorities have faced oppression and some have been banned in the country. Notably, in 2017 the Jehovah's Witnesses were outlawed in Russia, facing persecution ever since, after having been declared an extremist and non-traditional faith. In 2012, the research organization SRITA, in cooperation with the Ministry of Justice, published the Arena Atlas, an adjunct to the 2010 census, enumerating in detail the religious populations and nationalities of Russia, based on a large sample countrywide survey. The results showed that 47.3% of Russians declared themselves Christians, including Russian Orthodox, simply Orthodox, or members of non-Russian Orthodox churches, unaffiliated Christians, and less than 1% Old Believers, Catholics, or Protestants. Culture. Russian writers and philosophers have played an important role in the development of European literature and thought. The Russians have also greatly influenced classical music, ballet, sport, painting, and cinema. The nation has also made pioneering contributions to science and technology and space exploration. Russia is home to 30 UNESCO World Heritage Sites, 19 out of which are cultural, while 27 more sites lie on the tentative list. The large global Russian diaspora has also played a major role in spreading Russian culture throughout the world. Russia's national symbol, the double-headed eagle, dates back to the Tsardom period, and is featured in its coat of arms and heraldry. The Russian bear and Mother Russia are often used as national personifications of the country. Matryoshka dolls are considered a cultural icon of Russia.